Welcome everyone to this conversation with Dr. John Wiseman, the second in our series of PSC in Conversation, and it's being hosted this evening by myself and by Charles Lefevre. Psychology for a Safe Climate, as many of you know, and it's lovely to see so many familiar faces in the room today, we began 12 years ago when a small group of climate concerned psychologists gathered to talk about what they could do on climate change using their experience and expertise. And at that time, there was a lot of discourse, I guess, about the real need to understand and explore climate change denial. Why was it so challenging for people to accept the facts about what was happening? And in some ways, I think we're still asking that question, but perhaps there's a slightly different tenor to the discussion we're having. At that time, PSC began working on a booklet to address this issue, which was called Let's Speak About Climate Change. And this explored the terrain of climate change denial from a psychological perspective. In many ways, the conversation series that we're holding this year is a sort of return to that work that we used to do through conferences and publishing. We're really wanting to invigorate and interrogate some of the deeper conversations about climate change that include its existential, emotional, and psychological dimensions. So I'm pretty excited to have John with us here tonight. He's written a really fascinating book, and I think it's going to be a pretty interesting conversation. So welcome to Dr. John Wiseman, Professor John Wiseman. He's a senior research fellow with the Melbourne Climate Futures and adjunct professor at the Melbourne School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne. He's also a research fellow at the Centre for Policy Development and the board chair of the Next Economy. His current research and writing focuses on actions needed rapidly to phase out fossil fuels and accelerate the transition to a just and regenerative safe climate future. His most recent book is Hope and Courage in the Climate Crisis, Wisdom and Action in the Long Emergency. So Hope and Courage in the Climate Crisis explores ideas from diverse perspectives, from climate scientists and activists, psychologists and philosophers, Indigenous, faith-based and spiritual traditions that can help us face a harsh climate future with honesty and courage, meaning and purpose. Welcome, John. And Dr. Charles Lefevre is a psychiatrist and psychotherapist in private practice in Melbourne. He's been the chair of the psychotherapy section of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. For 10 years, he's been involved with Psychology for a Safe Climate, and he's currently the Deputy Executive Director. He's been interested in and writing and speaking about psychosocial perspectives on the natural environment and climate change for many years. He's involved in running PSC workshops and in the Climate Aware Practitioners program, which is a professional development program we run. He's liaised and given a number of talks in recent years to different mental health organisations like the College of Psychiatrists, Doctors for the Environment and GPs, and has co-authored a couple of articles on climate distress with them in the last year. So welcome, Charles. It's great to see your very familiar face here as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Charles and John to pick it up.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Beth. Thank you for your introduction, and perhaps we might just get on with it, really. But I've already met with John. We had a lovely cup of tea a couple of weeks ago, and got to know each other a bit. And I wish we'd recorded the conversation that we had then. We wouldn't have needed to speak today, perhaps. But look. What I'd like to ask you, John, to start with, and you may have other things to say as well, is really just a little bit about your own kind of climate journey, and particularly your journey to writing this book, which is so interesting.
Yeah, so thank you, Charles and Beth, and hello, good evening to everyone. I would also like to just begin by acknowledging I'm also speaking to you from near to the Mary Creek on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any who are with us this evening. My journey, my pathway to writing this book began about 15 years ago when I was working in a research centre on population health at Melbourne University, and I had a range of colleagues, climate scientists, friends and colleagues, and the more I spoke with them, the more it became clear to me that the greatest threat to health and of human beings, of other species, was clearly the climate crisis. And so, I'm sure like many other people on this call tonight, I made a decision then to refocus my energy on the question, well, what could I do to contribute to protecting and restoring a safe climate? And I find it kind of hard to believe that it was only about 10 years ago, in 2012, that I spent some time, I had the honor really of talking to some of the world's leading climate scientists and activists and policymakers. And the question I had to them was, at that time, was, well, was it possible? Was it technologically, was it financially possible to reduce emissions at the speed and scale required? And of course, the answer at that time was yes. It was technologically and financially possible. The key roadblocks were political. And perhaps for that reason, I've spent quite a bit of my last 10 years trying to work on what I sometimes think of as roadblock removal work. How do we remove those political and economic roadblocks to rapid action? But of course, the second conclusion back then in 2012 that everybody said was, gee, we really must see extremely rapid falls in emissions by the early, 2020s, was what people said at the time. And here, of course, we are in 2022, and the most recent climate science updates, but also what we see out the window, the fires, the floods, the storms, reminds us that of two things, really. One, that reducing greenhouse gas emissions remains our most urgent priority, and doing that at emergency speed. But secondly, the most recent climate science, the issues we see around us, also remind us that even with the fastest possible emissions reduction, we are on a tough journey. We are, as some people called it, facing a long unfolding emergency. So that realization is pretty tough for lots of us and lots of our friends and colleagues. But it led me to the next question, which was, so what ideas from all sorts of different traditions and perspectives might be helpful in navigating what's going to be a very different landscape, a very different world? And so I spoke with lots of friends and colleagues. I went on a bit of a journey, I guess, through works of philosophy, of psychology, of literature, of spiritual and faith-based practice, to try and address the question that is, as Charles and Beth said, at the center of this book. What are the ideas that can help us face a really tough future with hope and courage and wisdom? So that's, Charles, a bit of my journey in this space, and keen to hear others as well explore some of these issues.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, John. Well, look, we've got we perhaps might pursue the course which we talked about, really, which was to start off by trying to think about and talk about how we actually got to where we are now. And perhaps would you like to start off by saying a few words about that, John, in terms of your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty confronting, isn't it? I always feel, given the clarity with which climate scientists have spoken to us, the clarity with which activists like Greta Thunberg and others have spoken to us, how is it that we have not acted with greater speed and greater decisiveness? And in thinking about that, there's a couple of really obvious answers. Clearly, the power and the wealth of fossil fuel corporations and their allies in the media and finance industries. Yep, sure, that's clearly a key part of the reason, and the effectiveness with which the advertising and marketing industry has kept fueling our desire to consume. Sure, that's part of the answer. But I think, and you were talking earlier, I think, both Charles and Beth, about these questions of denial, if you like. I think it's too easy just to point the finger at vested interests, important as that is. And I know that there are a whole range of stories, narratives, myths, perhaps, that also feed into the ways in which all of us react and to the climate crisis. And I'm thinking of, the temptation to focus on, the short-term benefits of life as opposed to the longer consequences of our action. The seductive myth that infinite growth on a finite planet is possible, particularly if technology, the magic bullets of technology, will save us. So I think there's, alongside issues of power, there are also stories which have been quite seductive for all of us, which I think means that there's clearly a range of actions about overcoming power, but there are also, it makes the importance of finding new stories, new narratives that can help us break out of some of those insidious myths that have reduced our capacity to act.
Yeah, thank you, John. Could I make a contribution on this as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, look, I suppose, going back, there's obviously the sort of, I think you allude to it in your book, really, all these sort of historical influences of dualism and anthropocentrism and capitalism, and all these things which have really ideologically got us to where we are today. But on the other hand, I guess, really speaking from our, PSC perspective, from a psychological perspective, perhaps one of the most interesting writing of recent times has been from an author called Sally Weintraub, who a number of you may have heard of or read, and her book, The Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis, where she refers really to what she calls a culture of uncare, which is, she very much relates to something that has really massively increased with neoliberal exceptionalism, as she calls it, and that sort of uncare has partly led to a sort of situation of people not caring about others or the environment as well. And so that's one thing. And I suppose the other thing is really, a key thing is really that engaging with the climate crisis is such a psychological problem, really, because we have to truly, a lot of people, sorry, I'm going on a bit here, but look, it's one thing to engage intellectually, but that can really be a sort of type of denial, in a way, a sort of denial of the implications and what we call a disavowal. Whereas to actually engage emotionally is really a very painful process for people, that you really do have to deal with fear and sadness, particularly with grief, to really be able to do that. And that's why we, do the work that we do in terms of having groups which look at that, to really help people who have sort of become more aware emotionally aware, to actually share that and feel connected to others. So
I think they're all really important reflections, and it makes me also think about the question of how fast this conversation is shifting, even in the last 3 or 4 years since I started thinking about writing this book. And well, I guess there's some good news in that. I mean, there's probably fewer people who are outright climate deniers. There's probably an increased range of support for rapid energy transition. These are good things. But on the other hand, we're also deeply aware that firstly of how fast the climate catastrophe is unfolding, and that sense of it's not that long ago I can remember being in discussions like this where we talked about, gee, I'm really worried about what this means for my children and my grandchildren, and of course that's still true, but it's arrived. The climate crisis is not some thing to worry about in the future. It's right here, right now. And so that deepens, I agree, Charles, that sense of immediate grief and distress. And yet it also seems to me makes it even more important to find ways of sustaining action while we hold that grief and distress. We stay open to that, of course, but we don't get overwhelmed by it. And I guess that's a challenge that lots of us are trying to deal with all the time.
Yeah, well, I guess it really comes on to the next question about how we can do that, really, in both in terms of emotionally and in terms of hope. So
yeah,
I wonder, would you like to talk a little bit about, well, I suppose hope in the current times, really, realistic hope, perhaps I might say.
Yeah, I mean, we, hope, I imagine many of us have thought about this. We have to be pretty careful about the way we use this word. And that's certainly why I wanted to include a word like courage in the title of this book, not just hope. Hope as wishful thinking, as just unhelpful optimism is well, absolutely less than helpful. And the kind of hope I'm looking for is, as you say, realistic, it's radical, it's defiant, it's courageous. There's a nice phrase by the science fiction writer China Miéville, who talks about hope with teeth, which I think is quite a handy kind of phrase. Hope in that sense isn't the idea that everything is going to turn out all right. Of course not. Hope is the finding the strength, hope and courage to continue to act, to protect and restore a safe climate while realizing just how tough this task now is. I sometimes think, when we think about courage, Nelson Mandela famously said that courage isn't the absence of fear; it's the capacity to act while being afraid. And that seems to me to be an important part of the picture. I'll add just one other quick thought. We might want to talk in more detail about sort of particular ideas and sources of hope. But I was at a talk by the Indigenous writer Tony Birch on the weekend, and he used a phrase which I hadn't heard before, but I thought was kind of interesting. He talked about proactive pessimism, and holding together an appropriately pessimistic view of what we're confronting, but not letting that stand in the way of action. So that's another take, I think, on that concept of hope.
Yes. No, thank you. I'm just wondering what you think. I've been thinking about it. What does courage look like, do you think, in the climate crisis? How does courage show itself?
Well, I mean, maybe the best way into that is to talk about, the book explores many different examples and stories of hope and courage.
Open to learning.
But I think we've got somebody else on the line there. So let me come at that by talking about a few of the strands in the book, and one of them, the first one, is how does courage show itself? Well, when I think about the work of climate scientists, the unflinching honesty which many of them have displayed in speaking truth to power. And there's a phrase by the American author James Baldwin, which is perhaps relevant there, when he says that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's been faced. So, you know, one way in which courage is shown is through the science, through the evidence. And on that note, a book that I'd like to warmly recommend, if people haven't come across it, by the Australian climate scientist Joel Gergis, Humanity's Moment, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope, I think is a great example of somebody from that world demonstrating courage. But the second clear example would be the tenacity and courage of climate activists in so many ways. And to just give a couple of examples, School Strike for Climate, Seed Mob, the Pacific Climate Warriors, Market Forces, people who are acting in all kinds of ways to not just speak truth to power, but to overcome those political roadblocks I was talking about. And I suppose one important point that people in those movements, those collective action movements, talk about, of course, is not only the importance of taking that action, but of taking it with others. So, you know, the hope and courage, if you like, that we gain from standing shoulder to shoulder with others. I mean, that's important in terms of amplifying the effectiveness of our action, but it also helps us get up the next day and keep working. Let me stop there. That's, you know, two obvious starting points. Perhaps I'll mention one other, which is the courage and the tenacity and the determination of Indigenous and First Nation communities in addressing the climate crisis. I mean, as a non-Indigenous person, I guess my starting point there has to be recognizing and noting the ways in which climate change and climate change impacts are an intensification of colonial violence. And that's, I think, an important starting point for this discussion. But I also think there's an enormous amount we can learn from Indigenous and First Nation communities about resisting violence, about surviving under extremely difficult and often catastrophic circumstances, and also about understanding the ideas that can help us live in different sorts of catastrophic landscapes, and thinking and developing different sets of values about the way in which we live with our ecology. So there are three starting points, I think, for responding to that question, Charles.
Yeah, when you were talking, it made me think about the courage that people have. Well, actually, even to do with our work, really, in a way, the courage to actually accept your vulnerability and how you feel about the climate situation. It's one thing I really love about the Joel Gergis's book, that it's such a personal and emotional account from climate scientists. I think it must have taken a lot of courage to be able to actually really write that book, which was something very difficult for her, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, here, another strand, another set of ideas I've drawn to in the book and exploring is the insights from a range of Buddhist principles and practices. So I'm not a person of religious faith myself, but I've certainly been struck by the number of climate activists and climate scientists who in various ways draw on Buddhist understandings about impermanence and interdependence and compassion. But one in particular I found valuable is the work of Roshi Joan Halifax, who's the abbot at the Upaya Zen Buddhist Center in Santa Fe. And she's somebody who has worked on climate action, sure, and also on working with refugees and migrants, and also in people who are caregivers for terminally ill patients and prisoners on death row. So she's worked in many really tough contexts. And she notes that one of the questions she's often asked is, well, how do you keep going? You know, how do you find the strength to keep working in such hard and apparently hopeless situations? And she says this, she says, sitting with a dying person or a dying planet, we show up, we do the best we can. We rely, of course, on our altruism, our empathy, our integrity, our respect and our engagement and our compassion, but we keep showing up. And I think that's another way into the conversation about courage and hope in this context.
Yeah, look, I agree. I agree with everything you've said about courage. Buddhism. I agree as well that we had a Buddhist Roshi at one of our conferences, Susan Murphy. You may know.
Yes, indeed.
Very inspiring, and of course, I guess it leads into thinking about Joanna Macy, who's sort of covers both areas in a way, and her idea of active hope, which is a sort of an interesting idea, because it sort of, I don't know, I'm kind of keen to perhaps try and draw out a bit more the distinction, well, the sort of whole optimism, pessimism line, and a sort of hope line, if you like, because active hope, in a sense, is it sort of gets away from optimism and pessimism in a way. I think maybe, I don't know if you'd agree, but it really looks at sort of engagement and action and purpose as a way of just creating hope, regardless of the external situation, in a way.
Sure, I think Joanna Macy's work on active hope is I've always found that extremely valuable. Perhaps the complementary concept of radical hope, which comes from the work of the writer Thomas Lear, looking at the experience of First Nations American people in facing the implications of colonialism and genocide and the wiping out of the buffalo, and the question, so how in this catastrophic situation can we keep acting, can we keep working on these issues while realizing just how tough they're going to be. So yes, active hope, radical hope, realistic hope, I think these are all useful concepts. I was also drawn to a quote from Gie Bastida, who's a young climate activist in the US, and she does actually use this word optimism, and and I thought it was worth sharing, where she says that viewing our reality with optimism means recognizing that another future is possible, not promised. Optimism is about having steadfast confidence in our ability to solve huge challenges. Optimism is not soft, it is gritty. Every day brings dark news, and no end of people tell us that the world is going to hell. To take the low road is to succumb. To take the high road is to remain constant in the face of uncertainty. And I think that's an important point about, there's a lot of discussion, and we may well want to open this up about, the sort of hope and despair sort of language. And I get it that, you would be crazy not to look at the climate science evidence coming towards us and think that this is going to be really, really tough. But I think there are a couple of responses to that point about despair, if you like. I think the important advice that climate scientists will give us, that no matter how how difficult it will now be to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees, every 1/10 of a degree still matters a hell of a lot, and that we need to stay focused on that. But I also think Rebecca Solnit's advice that the world is never entirely predictable. It is never a done deal. There are always surprises. And I think we need to keep our eyes open to that, as well as to how difficult the situation is going to be. So, yeah, look, wishful thinking is a recipe for probably denial and delay, but despair is a recipe for not acting at all at times. And I think that's where we have to find a way of connecting our active hope to proactive pessimism and to action.
Yeah, look, I think they're all very good points. Although I do think perhaps despair is although it's a difficult thing, maybe, I mean, because sometimes we activists, I think, move between despair and hope. I mean, despair is perhaps also a feeling that we need to accept as important and to be understood. And in fact, in our workshops, often there's people can really be quite despairing, and through our workshops, sometimes people can feel quite different, because actually being able to express the despair and the pain can allow a sense of connection and perhaps some more hope. But
and I'm interested in that that experience. I mean, Charles, so in people talking about their despair and their grief, I mean, how do you find, what helps people connect that to action? What pathways from holding that sense of grief and despair enable people then to get up tomorrow morning and to also take action? I mean, do you find there are conversations that are particularly effective?
Well, I'd be interested to see what other PSC members say. But I think, look, I think just being able to express those feelings in a group can create such a strong sense of connection and purpose. Really. This is what I've found. I remember someone who sort of part of the way through our workshop sort of felt despair at what was going on, but then realized that the process actually led to something which could create more hope. So I think just sharing those feelings is incredibly important, and to feel that you're in the same boat with other people, and that you can then take action based on that.
Yeah, I mean, I find the framework principles of psychology for a safe climate around, combining that, facing the reality of the grief and the concern openly and honestly, but then combining that with collective action seems to me to be extremely valuable.
Yeah. Maybe we could move on to a sort of difficult area of the future, if you like, or even perhaps into the area of what one could call a sort of doomism, or the possibility of collapse, if you like, which is such a difficult area, which is so difficult for all of us to talk about, climate scientists and anybody in the public situation to talk about, really. And I think I mentioned to you when we were talking before about what Tim Flannery said when he gave a talk, and I had a fireside chat with him in the College of Psychiatrists Congress, and he said the next 10 years is vital. We've really got to do something in the next 10 years. And if we don't, it would be like treating a patient with Alzheimer's, that there's really, that the patient, all you can do is patch up the patient and kind of keep them comfortable, but really all is lost in a way, he was saying. But he also then said, but I'm optimistic that we are going to get it all done in the next 10 years. So it's sort of, it brings, I guess what he was saying brings up a lot of questions really, and the sort of whole question of I guess what happens if we do sort of think about the prospect that we're actually not going to, that we're actually going to stuff things up totally.
Yeah, well, we seem to be heading rapidly in that direction. Perhaps a few responses to that. One of the things that I do to try, and a lot of people do this now, I guess, to think about the future is a kind of backcasting exercise. So in the at the end of the Hope and Courage book, there's a fictional oration by an eminent climate scientist in 2050, looking back on what happened over the from 2020 onwards, and she says sort of she has two main messages really. She says, well, it's remarkable how successful we were at accelerating the energy transition. I mean, things look, goodness me, remember Donald Trump, she says, and remember how bad things looked like. I don't think she actually refers to Scott Morrison, but she probably might have. And she says, but look, there are a number of triggers that really did accelerate, the energy transition. There was a surprising degree of leadership. Activism really did start to change the rules of the game. We really did start to see the impact of legal actions, changing the way corporations operated. So that's a story of some power, and I think that's important to stay with when we think about the future, and even now, to think about what are the doors that are being pushed open by activists, by legal action, by all kinds of creativity and inventiveness, not just on technology, but socially. So that's a good news story, I guess. But she also says, so, but of course, it didn't happen fast enough. And, we have seen a vast array, not necessarily of global collapse, but of collapsing societies, of collapsing environments, that has had caused enormous distress. And she then talks to this point about, so what was important was accelerating action, but also exploring new ideas, new ways of being, new ways of living. And I think that's the discussion that's before us now. And maybe I'll conclude, I think, of this part of the discussion by referring to three sources that I think I found helpful in thinking about the future in that way. And one of them, and people on this call may be aware of Kim Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry for the Future, which I think is a helpful way of not just imagining the kind of actions that are needed, and it's a good overview of all of the different ways in which you could imagine a safer climate future unfolding. But in particular, he's interested in how do we create the bridge, given how difficult the situation we are now in. What are the ways in which we can create the bridge to the future? What's going to be the combination of political leadership and activism that will take us there? The second suggestion I would have is there's a trilogy by the American science fiction writer N.K. Jemisin called the Broken Earth Trilogy. And what she does in that set of books is to say, let's imagine a world in which we're not just talking about collapse, we're talking about an Earth in which there are increasingly frequent and unpredictable and devastating, not just fires and floods and storms, but the very fabric of the Earth has collapsed. And so we're facing constant unfolding earthquakes and volcanoes and so on. And she suggests that, so she's asking the question, so how do we live? How do you live in that sort of a collapsing world, if you like? And she draws on, I think she talks about four principles are implicit in this, which I think are each worth unpacking a little bit. She talks about the importance of really deeply recognizing and respecting the complexity and fragility of all the peoples and species and ecologies of the Earth. It's a point about deeply understanding complexity and fragility and overcoming, as you said earlier, Charles, that sense of split between human beings and nature. She talks about the importance of overcoming our hubris and paying much closer attention to the risks and consequences of overstepping the limits of our knowledge and power. She talks about creating spaces and systems where we can renew and relearn our understandings of the skills that we need to flourish in an interdependent world. And of course, she talks about the need to redistribute power and wealth in order to enable those new ways of living to be enacted. So the conversation I'd be keen to trigger here is what others think about, how, not just what ideas, but also what institutions, what practices can we support and nurture in a world that is, if you like, collapsing. The last thought I have, Charles, there, before perhaps we open it up to a larger discussion, I just wanted to share a poem. And it's a poem by one of my favorite poets, a guy called Gary Snyder, who's been a Buddhist practitioner and an ecological activist for many years. And it's quite a short poem, but I think it's relevant to this discussion. And it's called For the Children. And the poem goes like this. The rising hills, the slopes of statistics lie before us. The steep climb of everything going up as we all go down. In the next century, or the one beyond that, they say, are valleys, pastures, we can meet there in peace if we make it. To climb these coming crests, one word to you and your children. Stay together, learn the flowers, go light. And I think we've covered a lot of ground, but I find those last three phrases, stay together, learn the flowers, go light, I find them helpful as starting points for the discussion about how we might go forward into a challenging future.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. That's a lovely poem. I really like it. Thank you. So I'm not quite sure whether we're going to questions now, Beth, or I had possibly some other comments, but
yeah, perhaps Charles, if you want to offer your closing comments, and then I'll open it up to some questions. There have been a few in the chat, and then we'll open it up for people to speak as well.
Okay, well, I guess for me the interesting thing is just what the trajectory will be like in the next number of years, really, and that we are going to be going through well, as John, I guess, has just been saying, we are going to be going through a very difficult time, one way or another, and how we come through it is another question. So another thing I'd just throw in there is the work of Jem Bendel, Deep Adaptation, where he sort of he takes a sort of rather what one could take a pessimistic view, that really we've got to accept that things really are going to collapse, even though they can perhaps recover, that whatever we do now is really not going to, it's just delusional to think that we are going to actually really not stuff things up totally. And in fact, he's of course divided people a lot, and climate scientists are very divided about him. So Will Steffen, like a lot of climate scientists, backs both horses. On the one hand, he sort of says he wrote something about the book that Jem Bendel's written, but on the other hand, he also said what John was saying about every fraction of a degree makes all the difference. But Jem Bendel's got some very interesting ideas about how we can sort of face the future. He's got 4 R's: resilience, relinquishing, restoration, and reconciliation, which are sort of interesting views in terms of how to face a future where there is a sort of collapse, and where there is certainly radical hope that is needed, which perhaps we can tease out a bit more in the questions as well. I think radical hope is a very complex notion, because it's trying to have a vision of something that you actually don't really know anything about. You don't even know what really you're hoping for. So
I mean, the Bendel's, those 4 principles, the 4 R's, if you like, I mean, they seem to make, I think they're sensible and useful and insightful, but it still seems to me to, if you sort of use the word collapse in that very general sense, I mean, firstly, it still seems to me to run the risk of undermining or reducing people's sense of that there's anything at all that you can do that's effective. I wonder if we need to unpack that word collapse a little bit. I mean, as to there are that can mean many things and in many different settings, and it may mean something very different to people in the Amazon, to people in more affluent countries and so on. So I just think we need to perhaps be a bit more precise about how we're using that term.
Yeah, I think that's a very, 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 very true. Yeah, because it can sound very pessimistic, can't it? Rather than in the sense of that we're going to go through a period of perhaps there's definitely going to be some types of collapse, if you like, for the next number of years. But that doesn't mean that humanity is totally doomed.
I mean, one aside there, I suppose, is we're already seeing, clear signs of collapse. And one aspect of that I think is becoming increasingly clear is the cascading intersections of environmental collapse, and how that then translates into social and economic and political collapse as well. If we look at the most obvious examples, I suppose, being the pressure on of refugees and immigration from sub-Saharan Africa, and in terms of those impacts. So how those intersecting forms of collapse will unfold, I think, is important to dissect and understand, and therefore to address.
Yeah, thanks, John. I'll hand over perhaps to Beth to field some questions, or throw some questions at us.
Yep, indeed. Yeah, thank you both. And feel there's a spiraling quality to this conversation. It sort of feels like we're circling deeper each round, so I am curious to see where we'll go in light of some of the questions that are coming through on the chat. One that I'll start with, I guess, on the basis of the poem that you shared, John, and particularly that last line, stay together, learn the flowers, go light. And that sort of combined with the title of the poem for the children, I feel brought me back to a question that was sort of posed earlier in the chat, which was around the difficulty perhaps of how we talk truthfully with and listen openly to our climate worried children, and how central children are in this conversation. You know, they're both the site of hope, and they're the place we have to explain the mess that we're in. And I'd just be really curious to hear from you, John. Yeah, your thoughts on how to kind of speak with that courage, or how to elicit and bring forth that courage and hope with younger people, given the state of the world.
It's a question I'm often asked, and I think it's a really tough, I mean, it's an essential question and a really tough question. And there are some obvious starting points about, you know, children of different ages, you know, we would talk in different ways with. I think the couple of points I would start with is, I mean, firstly, for somebody of my age, I mean, listening really carefully has to be the starting point, I think. But not, there's also the risk there is, and I think it's implicit in what you say, Beth, is, I mean, it's great to be able to say, well, you know, isn't it extraordinary what School Strike for Climate has done? Isn't it, you know, inspiring and impressive, and that's great. But finding the right balance between being inspired by that, by listening carefully, but not then abrogating my responsibility, our responsibility as well. And so I think I suppose to me, it's the same as in any of these discussions about finding a respectful conversation where we all take responsibility for our actions in the best way we can. But I'd be keen to hear other views actually in the room, if you like, on this question, because I reckon it's really tough. I don't think any of us have, you know, a magic answer to this one, but I think it's really important. I mean, Charles, what's your take on this?
I'd be interested in what other people in the room think. Actually, I agree with what you're saying. It's something really difficult in terms of what is said. Well, as you say, the age makes a lot of difference, and but it is something that a lot of young people talk to each other about, and I guess a lot of parents sometimes can be quite nervous about what to say, but their children already know it. So I know that some of the people on this call have done some work with children and parents, so it might be interesting perhaps to hear from them about their experience.
Sure. Would anyone like to unmute and respond to that, if anyone has anything further they'd want to add beyond what John and Charles have shared in response to that question? Can always take a little while for those who've been listening to kind of warm up and find voices.
Children certainly, just while other people are trying to find their voice, children have been very influential on their parents. I think that's another thing. And, when I went to see Monique Ryan, the Teal candidate in Hawthorne, really she got involved in politics because of the concern of her teenage daughter. So I think parents have got a lot to learn from their children, as you say, John, to be able to listen is perhaps what well, perhaps what we oldies particularly need to do, and what parents of young children need to do.
We've just got Rog with his hand up. Carol, you're screen sharing for some reason. Would you like to speak? Yep, you can unmute yourself. Yeah,
that was me. Sorry, no, I just I lost a syllable there. Wasn't sure if you were mentioning me. I just had a little thought on, I don't know, there's a French film called Heure de Sortie in French, or Exit Time, that was on SBS, and I'm not going to spoil it, but I just in this, it's about teenagers, and if people haven't seen it, I just recommend seeing it. It's intense in terms of the way we're talking about. It just sort of deepens the question to watch that film in a way. But I just wanted to chuck that in. That's all.
I just wanted to say, I wanted to respond because I saw what Carol had got on her screen, and it was actually very relevant, because it's based on this sort of study of young people, that very important study that was published at the beginning of the year in the Lancet Planetary Health, which was a survey of young people and quite how they do feel. And it's not surprising in a way, but it's quite shocking, actually, the statistics. I don't know if you know that paper, John, but the level of feelings of sort of fear and sadness and anger is great, and also the sense of how much children can trust governments, and also well, that actually an awful lot, well, again, it brings up the question of what collapse means, but there are very significant percentage of young people feel that humanity is doomed, and that they really would seriously consider not having children. So it's sort of so young people certainly have a lot of fears. There's no doubt about it.
Which clearly, I mean, part of the answer has to be, you know, the finding the right mix, doesn't it, of care and compassion and support for the immediate emotional pain and grief and dismay, holding that on the one hand, and the links to how we then work together in whatever forms of collective action make sense at whatever age we are and wherever we are, to find ways of turning that grief and dismay into action. I think, but certainly, you know, in the immediate sense, the need for care in the deepest way possible. Beth, I think I can see a hand.
Yeah, Caroline's just put her hand up, so pass over to you.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Charles and John, for your conversation. My mind keeps coming back to a study that was done in London in the 1980s, where I was engaged with the anti-nuclear weapons movement. And the study showed that children's anxiety about nuclear war diminished in proportion to their sense of their parents' activism and doing something about it. And so I kind of bring that forward to, I mean, at that point, you know, the activism was taking action to protest against government, you know, government actions, or to try to, you know, propel governments to act in certain ways. But in this one, you know, the problem is in the household as well. You know, the problem is everywhere, and the problem is identifiably in the daily lives of parents and how we are living in a carbon economy and a carbon culture. So I'm just really interested in you know, how that plays out now. I mean, the study doesn't surprise me now of just how much anxiety there is, and I guess, you know, so much more to how to have honest and open, age appropriate, but honest conversations with children about our own sense of participation and responsibility. And so I just want to put that forward, but I mean, I do see that there's a link, but maybe kind of accelerated at the present, because it brings it home. Thank you.
Yeah,
And I only say that having lived in the 1980s in London, and having been part of the nuclear disarmament movement at the time as well, I think the analogy is really important. And yes, I think that connection between children's sense of hope, if you like, and at least a sense that their parents are on the same page and are listening is obviously a critical starting point. So yeah. Sorry, Charles, I cut you off there.
You know, I was just going to say, yeah, look, I agree with all of that, and I think it's, yeah, that children need to have that sort of the support, if you like, and I guess the activism comes with the sort of belief system and as well as the action, and I think it's important for those of us who are mental health practitioners to sort of be aware of that if we do happen to see young people, but that the whole support situation that they have is so vital. And if they don't have it at home or in school, we need to try and help them find different support situations, because it is critical to, I think, to them being able to sort of find hope, if you like, and feel a sense to have some sense of power as well.
Thanks, Charles. I can see Carol's got her hand raised as well, so I'll go to you, Carol.
Look, I just want to apologise for sharing my screen. I certainly didn't mean to do that, but I was looking up something because I was wanting to look up the statistics that in that study of 10,000 children that was done globally in 10 countries, and 39% of the kids said that they were ignored when they raised the subject of climate change with adults, and that's what it's just shocking. And I think it does raise. I support what Carol Ann was saying, and John and Charles are saying that we do need to engage with children, and I think the worst thing is to sort of fob them off. And it does require parents to actually be able to come to terms with their own feelings about climate change, that they do the emotional work first of actually knowing what they feel, which is a little ad for our climate cafes, that people can come along and actually talk about their feelings and start the process, which we know is a sort of an endless one of coming to terms with the climate reality. But, I think poor kids, if they receive a blank screen, it's shocking. It's really letting them down, I think.
Carol, just a quick question. I mean, do you think that that's changing? The honesty of parents, the honesty of those conversations?
Oh, look, it's very hard, but at least parents are asking, how do we handle it? And so that's good that they're thinking about it instead of just ignoring it. So, but it's hard to tell for how it's changing.
Sorry, Charles.
I was just going to say, I think it's a really important area, and one which we've sort of hovered on the edge of, is really kind of helping young people and helping in the school situation. I mean, really, there needs to be, one could argue that there needs to be a sort of a whole program really in a school situation to help with young children's, well, let's call it resilience, in a very positive way of talking about that word, if you like. Emotional resilience to the climate situation.
I mean, I think it's also just one practical implication of this is that, and again, it's about the ways in which this conversation has changed over the last 5 to 10 years, is I've certainly been perhaps put most of my work in the last 10 years into how to overcome the political roadblocks that stand in the way of the fastest possible emissions reduction. That's where I've been putting my energy. As I look at the consequences of fire and floods and storms and so on, I think about, well, what does that mean in terms of the work I put into those very practical issues of dealing with the disasters unfolding around us and the practical implications psychologically and emotionally. So it affects, I think, so no, for me, some questions about where I put my energy.
I can just see Emma's had her hand up for a little while. Did you have a question, Emma?
Thank you. Yes, I do. And it's not entirely related to what we're talking about now. So I just want to make sure I'm not interrupting the, kind of this part of the discussion.
That's all right. It's the nature of the beast. We'll move where it goes, and you never know, it might rear itself again unexpectedly.
Yeah, great. Look, thank you. This has been so interesting. We started, Beth, you started this presentation by really acknowledging that this is embodied work and embodied practice. And so John and Charles, I'm interested to hear about where you find the hope and what practices, that you do in your daily lives, where that joy is cultivated, that connection is cultivated, and keeps you really connected to it in a really embodied way.
Do you want to
Charles?
Go?
Well, I'll just say two things. I think, Beth, starting by reminding us about the breath is a pretty good place to start here, and certainly the value, I find considerable value in, Buddhist insights and practice, including that very embodied kind of practice, and that as a daily practice is important to me. But the other, the thing, of course, that so many people talk about is the importance of being by the ocean, being in the mountains, being in the forest, that is incredibly rejuvenating, nourishing. There's a quote which I always keep coming back to from Rachel Carson, where she talks about it in this way: those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts. There is symbolic as well as actual beauty in the migration of the birds, the ebb and flow of the tides, the folded bud ready for the spring. There is something infinitely healing in the repeated refrains of nature, the assurance that dawn comes after night and spring after the winter. And I've always found those sentiments important and valuable, although I sometimes, when I share that with people, they say, yeah, but, will spring come after the winter? So there's that. But Charles, your reflections?
Yeah, look, thank you, John. It made me think of something I've just been feeling fairly recently, of just when I get up in the morning and actually go outside and look outside my house, outside the built environment, and just see what's in the sky and what's on the earth, and that in itself is quite inspiring. I also like Buddhist practice, although I'm a very poor practitioner, and I think the other thing which I think really helps is actually being part of Psychology for a Safe Climate. It's really lovely to sort of just have a group of people who sort of share the same sort of well, we're on the same page in a way, and sort of I mean, we're able to sort of talk about these things, which is not so easy. So I don't know if I'm sure there are lots of other things we could both say about the question, but it's actually quite a difficult one, really, because it's you can find. I think what I love. I love a quote of Jem Bendel's. It's what was it? I wrote it down sometime. It said, "I can't hope for a better future, but what I do hope for is a better present," and I think that's quite nice. Or I may have misquoted it, but perhaps we can hope just from minute to minute and day to day.
I can see Carol has her hand up, and then Rog. You're muted, Carol.
And I'm just reminded of when we do one of our workshops where people are expressing their deepest feelings of grief, and there's really a very sad atmosphere and quite a lot of bleak feeling. And we then ask people, if we're doing it on Zoom, to go outside and find something outside in nature and bring it in, or if we're in a live thing, we ask them to go outside. And it's absolutely astounding how the whole atmosphere changes so rapidly when people find a beautiful leaf or a bud that's about to open. So you know, it's quite striking how significant that is.
It was making me wonder to what extent a lot of other, indigenous people, if you like, had words for hope, because did you need to hope? In a sense, the world was suffused with hope, just the turning of the day and the seasons. I don't know. Do you know, John?
No, I don't know the answer to the question about particular words for hope in those cultures. I think that's would be a good question to ask.
Rog, I saw you had your hand up earlier, but it's gone down again. Did you?
Oh yeah, I'm in. Yeah. Yeah, I've got a few thoughts. I'll put 1.5 at a time and see how we go around on the chat, and might chuck in another one. All right. A term that I use for myself is the idea of post-hope. It's easy to put post on anything. I went to uni in the 90s and there was post on everything, but so I'd like a better term for it. But there was a researcher who was doing interviews of climate activists. We were having climate camps about 10 or 12 years ago, like at coal sites and stuff, and someone was going around interviewing people individually, and it was like people were confessing to her like a priest, like they were there and people kept turning up, but they didn't think what they were doing was going to be enough. It wasn't going to be wasn't winning, but no one said that to each other. This people, are more open, have been more open in that decade, but there was sort of, at least amongst activists, this might not apply to the sort of a big part of the broader population that still needs to shift, was sort of a stubbornness, a determination, words like sort of solidarity or resistance, and yeah, I might check in another thought that might relate and see what people want to say, if people have comments on it. It was also about the idea of despair, that binary. It's maybe trying to get past that binary, out of that binary, which I think you said John said some words on, but the thought on maybe a thought on despair is the idea that we need to actually go through despair and out the other side, not oscillate back and sort of back and forwards in creating these fragile hopes that then crumble amongst new realities and kind of the inertia of our society and all that kind of stuff. And there's lots of deep cultural ideas from Dante's Inferno to and wisdom in that idea about facing your demons and coming out of that side, out through that, transformed into a different kind of mode. But that maybe that's enough to get some thoughts on.
Thank you, Raj. I'm just aware of the time, and I think you know, I wish we had another hour because I feel like now we're really spiraling somewhere deep. Yeah, really, really wonderful thoughts. I'm going to throw over to Anthony, and then I might give John and Charles just a chance to close in response to that as well. Anthony, did you want to add anything final?
Yes, I did. Thank you. Yeah, I noticed CB, which I assume is Celeste, is talking about inner work and Buddhist psychology. And this really hooks into something that I wanted to say, because I see a great link between a sense of hope and our sense of well-being. And I see that the absence of hope is hopelessness, of course, which leads to helplessness and a poor sense of well-being. So when I ask the question, where do I get my sense of well-being from? I think if that's based on hope in relation to the state of the world, then that's likely to lead to a poor outcome. However, if it comes from within, from our sense of values, our sense of what we stand for, then I think we can retain a far better sense of well-being. And that does link in with what Celeste has got about, you know, inner work and Buddhist psychology, and various others have mentioned Buddhism, like Charles and John have mentioned that as well. So I'd see that's the way that I see that link between hope and a sense of well-being, or why hope is important, because that's got to do with our well-being, and it's a question of where do we get our sense of well-being from.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, a really important direction for reflection. John and Charles, did you want to just mention anything in relation to that? Just bearing in mind we have about 4 minutes.
I'll just offer a quote also from Václav Havel, thinking of another pretty hopeless time he was facing in Eastern Europe. Hope, he said, is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something is worth doing no matter how it turns out. And I think that relates to Anthony, your point that how we act personally, emotionally, collectively, these are critical decisions for us all, facing the reality, you know, of how tough things are going to be, but still, as you rightly say, I think making carefully considered reflections and that inform our action on a day-to-day basis. So that's but I also would like to perhaps take this opportunity, Beth, to just thank everyone for this conversation. And as somebody said to me, the work of Psychology for a Safe Climate, you know, is enormously important for all the reasons we've been talking about. So thank you for all that work as well.
Thanks, John. Well, I might wind us up there, Charles, unless you've got anything burning you want to add.
No, I just wanted to thank John, but for his wisdom and for what he's offered us this evening. It's been immensely helpful.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, for writing the book and for showing up tonight to have this conversation. It's been really rich, and thank you as well, Charles, for participating and bringing your expertise and experience in this area as well. And thank you, of course, to our participants. Some really wonderful comments and questions in the chat. I've been, following that, and really wonderful questions and comments spoken as well.